The Samsara Quartet by Kovacs. Prologue. Caught in a cosmic limbo, the world sails the silent seas of black, locked in a dance with the scarlet light of a fiery globe. A single eye, like the eye of a titan that was, and before its gaze the world was naked. And naked there were the sins and tribulations of its inhabitants. Cursed they were, though not with eternal sufferance, but with the silence that would come the day the sun dies. There was once a man called Neroth Sergius, in whom many had seen what a man ought to be, for he was strong-willed, and his great brawn and wit served him well in many battles since his youth. Renowned he was, thus, by his kin, the Chaldeans, whose republic he fought for many times, filling its coffers with a godly sum of loot after each campaign. But though he garnered much affection, his heart would grow colder by the years, as he had little love for the crooked leadership of his country and the self-effacing plebs who fell for their guile and circus. So the seeds of treacherous thoughts had festered in his mind for long, and then came a curious concurrence of stranger paths that at last led him here, the sanctum. An island, yonder the known borders of the world, a place warped by powers of the most peculiar characteristics, where time and space was but a plaything, that beckoned to but a single warden, a shadow depository of extraordinary knowledge and wealth. This was the home to that elusive being, the naiad of arcane wisdom and witchcraft, who answers to many names, but he knew her simply as the Voyager. Nerith stood upon the foredeck of his war galley, dark eyes gazing out onto the war-torn horizon, nostrils filled with the acrid scent of smoke. On his shoulder he rested his trusty battle-axe. Its blade was wide and pitted and dark, but 'twas a mighty weapon nevertheless. Beside him were his officers, standing proud in the raging wind that tore at the red plumes atop their helms. He gazed to his left and then his right, watching the wings of his dark fleet closing in on their target. Long, low gate, sharp-beaked war galleys mounted with war machines and manned by his skilled, fierce men. Their prows tore up the opal stands. The deep wail of oxen horn rose, followed by eager war cries as hundreds spilled forth with spearheads gleaming white. From the scarlet forests that reared before them rose the sounds of throaty bestial roars, eyes glimmering in the bushes ahead, primal and full of fiery wrath, and therewith the hordes of beasts spilled forth. Gray fur beasts charged forth. Their aspect was like that of gorillas, bulky, wide, and long-limbed, with great claws at the end. Their heads, tough, were long-faced, wide jaws full of shark teeth, and from their slanting foreheads sharp-pointed antlers grew, soon to be tainted and red. Beside them came the long-tailed basilisks, dragging their muscled body across the foliage with terrific speed, emboldened by the scent of plentiful prey. War cries rose, and the shrill wailing of oxen horns came therewith. The battle raged on, beasts against man, and bodies were heaped high. But the battle lines held, for the Calds were skilled with the ballistas and rope bombs as well as they were with spear and shield. But not even this would have availed for long, if not for the being that brought them here. Neroth's recent ally, he who had promised him much and above all was a mighty sorcerer, warrior, and proprietor of a divine vision, the grand design. The sinking sun colored the skies as if with the vapor of blood, and the yonder horizons were cloaked in red mists and sullen clouds, swirling under the descending shadows of the infinite. Under that gloomy sky, like pillars that held the heavens, the austere black stone monoliths stood imperturbable, marked with great runes casting dreadful shadows over the turmoil. The great gray mountain, the sanctuary of the hybrid, loomed like a stolid, cold-blooded leviathan. It sat, waiting them with an open maw, from which, like a long venomous tongue, rolled the obsidian pathway that jotted across the long mile nearing the shore. And into that maw his men had marched, gladly following the hulking figure of Jachim the golem, their eyes alight with faith and ambition. Jachim was a man-like creature in both look and anatomy, formed of enchanted clay and imbued with primordial sorcery, whose body can withstand the might of iron and claw and venom and fire. In his hand he bore his great stone-headed maul, with which he swept away the beasts that dared him. In his left he bore a luminous item. 'Twas the eye of the Cyclops, a mighty artifact said to be older than the moon in the Midland Mountains. Wild creatures spilled forth from a myriad of pocket dimensions, winged beings with long sinuous bodies and knife-beaked faces, with cruel lidless eyes and claws like curved knives. Accursed fiends of cold winter realms hulking like mastodons, white-furred but with faces that ended in a flat nose and white fangs under blood-crazed eyes. Neroth's right-hand man watched these happenings through a telescope and said, "The center is pushing far too hastily. Our wings shan't keep up with them, but they will be circled unless we act." Neroth laid his great hand upon the man's shoulder and said, smiling. He then raised his battle-axe and gave signal to his bodyguards and all his reserves to join the battle. His black war galleys spurned forth on their lanky oars, and the mood for battle was strong in his men. The great leather drums, mounted on the poop decks, boomed aloud and at a quick pace, and the rest of the Chaldean joined in, making clamor with their brass shields. Ere long, their sandaled feet trotted the sands, and falling into the tight formation, they mounted the long black road behind their war master, their weapons well caked in the hot blood of beasts. Beside them, an infernal scenery came to life as the clayman began to work his magic. Strange apparitions appeared in the air like gashes in the fabric of reality itself, wounds spitting forth arcs of fiery matter. Flocks of harlequin birds rose, fleeing seaward, and the forests were aflame thereon, with long trails and black smoke rittering skyward, coiling and twisting like the many heads of the brazen hydra. Beset by the scorched fields, Neroth and his bronze-clad bodyguards marched forward imperturbably. The defiant wind tore at his long black hair and vermilion cape. His ears were filled with the cacophony of burning timber and the roaring, panicking wilderness. His sharp, angular features remained stern, even when set upon by the hulking, pale-haired monster. It came from the right, bursting out from the wall of flame-bitten jungle leaves. Its hide stank with the blood, ashen burns, and its face was like that of a bear with the horns of a ram and a nose of a cat, but the body of a great tiger walking on its hind legs whilst bearing long, hooked, gore-flecked claws on front paws as long as its body. Neroth acted quickly, though with the certainty of a man who knew he was nothing's sort of invincible. He had two-handed his battle-axe and charged forth, and so quick he was, his bodyguards could barely keep up with his pace. The beast lunged forth, and Neroth ducked. He found himself by the creature's side, and so swung his axe with all of his might his thickly muscled arms and broad shoulders could muster, cleaving through sinew, bones, flesh, and hide. The creature whined, but ere it could make another move, the guards buried their spearheads into it, whilst Neroth freed his weapon and split thick skull in twain. Face spotted with glistening blood, he stood above his foe like a hero at the end of a mystical quarrel, etched upon a colorful mural, and the men hailed him as such. Meanwhile, Jachim, always relentless, pushed on without a care, and at last, when the tall arched austere gates of black ironed ebony stood before him, he raised the eye in his hand, cast certain runes upon it, and uttered his strange imprecations that were not shaped to be uttered by mere men. And therewith the globe, 'twas like a great Aegean pearl, began to glow with sinister light. Jachim raised his right hand, and then came the flash of light, the thunder's roar, and the earth cracked before them, and all over the island spewing great gusts of sickly-colored mist. When it thinned, the soldiers saw the gates cloven in twain, like more than a shattered frame hanging on molten hinges. The battle is won, Neroth concluded. Yet unbeknownst to them, a shadow sneaked across the roaring waves. Sleek and subtle it was, sliding amidst the Panther Gate war galleys. Occupied by their work, the soldiers caught not a glance of his elusive apparitions, but were themselves watched in turn by eyes that shined like a pair of enchanted sapphires. Beyond the realm of mortal perceptions and corporeal mass within a plane parallel yet untouchable, there was a ship made of material, alien to the planet, enchanted with the oldest magic of the cosmos. It had no oars nor sails, but moved by luminescent energies that resided within the great emerald triangle perched atop the ancient device, and was moved by the will of the ones whose name was Karen. He had but one passenger, whose mind was bristled by a strange sense of solemnity, for it was her home that was in flames, and to her mind that was shaped by the experience of many centuries. The sight of that thing was almost like a mirage, birthed in the boiling heat of desert plains. It was almost too strange to be real, though the truth could not be denied. So she thought, if such a deed was aught to be done, then 'tis well that it was done quickly. Still, I am not shaped to grieve my fate like a wailing old crone. Nay, the pleasure of that thou'll never taste. If such is the price of my oversight or indolence, I shall suffer it. But woe on thee, my peerless kinsman. This fruit of thine labor shall go sour in thine mouth. I'll make sure of that. In the meantime, whilst I put my own schemes into motion, I let ye enjoy the time of merriment. But upon the name of crafty Odysseus, I swear I shall return. Indeed, the Calds were merry with their newly acquired prize, for the sanctum was a place of unparalleled wealth, not one of them had dreamt of. Each vault was like the belly of an ancient primordial leviathan that could swallow ships in whole, and indeed some of these were made to house vessels both familiar and wholly alien to their eyes. Others were made to be archives where the scriptures and potpourri of all manners were kept, be they as mundane of a subject as mere food recipes or fluoride poems, or as invaluable as descriptions of thaumagistical practices and conjurations that could summon elemental beings, bind demons, and appease spirits, albeit written in tongues hitherto unknown to them. Now, being the warrior kind, the Cald took the most fancy to the storages of various armaments, often engaging in mock fights, playing out imaginary battles between gods and titans and other supernatural beings, though only if they could find the fitting pieces, as many of the armors were made for creatures of unusual bodily proportions. Shortly thereafter, as they tried to explore the rest of the preternatural mountain, they began to face certain difficulties. At first, it was merely the unusual composition of the place that troubled them, as the higher levels could not be reached with stairs, but by lean vertical shafts that may have been made for flying creatures. This obstacle they overcame with ropes and ladders, but as they advanced deeper, they found themselves in even stranger places, in hallways where the walls had the likeness of quicksilver at once flowing and solid, but no chambers to be found, only paths looping in on themselves. Therein the air was strong with magic and gloomy, and the hair stood on the back of he who dared thither. Neither Jachim nor Neroth believed it would be easy to unlock the secrets of the sanctum, but it was not well to let their men grow weary either. Mortal men knew better and preferred the worldly struggles of mind and body to that of prenaturnal these two had grown so used to by now. And so Neroth summoned his 19th officer to the council in the main hall, that great hexagonal chamber that was like the museum, wherein the artistry of forgotten realms were displayed. Fragments of murals suspended in stasis fields, mirrored paintings sitting still in glass prisons, each depicting various scenarios and people of strange places, or creatures of alien habitation, or abstract dreams of fever-driven minds. There were busts and small statues of themselves by the walls. There were other carvings, too, of jade and amethyst, and jet-hewn to the shapes of cockatrice and sphinx and turtles that stood like men, often as tall or taller than man. It was all laid out in the orderly manner around the long mahogany table that sat a few paces from the end of the descending stairs of gold-trimmed red granite. The council opened merrily, for wine was in abundance, and though they were strangers to this place, they carelessly indulged themselves on the fruits of those internal gardens and wineries housed within certain chambers. Yet there was one who stood alone and aloof in that improvised banquet hall, yet unsatisfied, even after reaping a victory in so far unprecedented. There was a time when Jachim the Golem could enjoy the plain deceptive entertainment of mortal senses. But now, in his triumph, he found himself in a strange ambivalent mood. The Voyager was his ancient foe, made foe by the rules of the very cosmos itself, the immutable opposite to them in all aspects save one. Both were Empyrean beings, intermediaries between the realms intertwined, between the tangible and the intangible worlds of existence, between those tied to the corporeal senses and those that floated through the ether. And yet, like fate's fickle joke, they were bent to strife against one another in perpetuity. For she was a predator through and through, fueled by primal instincts and desires, though her insidious guile could and did fool many mortals and otherwise. She was a vulture that pecked upon the bones of bygone epochs, the vile she-beast of carrion temperament, with whom came the waves of putrefaction that wiped away the bliss of many ages. Her gifts and teachings were woes in and of themselves, half-truths and venomous deceits that could only rot. He, however, was an architect. He was the sublime revelation, the inevitable conclusion, he thought. For the mind that is awake and armed with reason was nothing less than duty-bound to assert himself over the waking world, over reality and even unreality, lest become the victim to the whims of the cosmos. The grand design must be attained. Those of flesh and blood could not realize this ambition, and those of the divine and infernal cared not what was beyond their preordained role. As to them, future and past were but meaningless delusions. Such was his disposition. And so, he thought, I shall break the pillar of heaven and will build upon heaven's ruins. Thus, the stars shall move by my will and snuff them whenever it pleases me. Life will prosper or suffer if I deem it so under the guide of a supreme conscience. By this I shall unite all that is split and make the kingdom supreme. Then the voice of Neroth echoed in the great hall. When man makes war on fate and makes a goodly harvest thereafter, he earned the right to celebrate. Is he not, my friend? He said, raising his cup of sour sweet ale toward him. Jachim cast his glance once upon the council, but said naught. And so Neroth continued, No longer we will suffer the grind's heels of eternally cycling follies that befell so many before us. Even now we are nearing the golden gates of true freedom. Still, we are yet forbid to pass, the claimant said at last. Let not thy success get into thy heads, lest the future will grow dim and die the way of dusty death. Didst thou forget that this place is a convergence of both physical and metaphysical, and what it may bring with it? Decades would not purify this island of our influence. Even now, the earth does not inter the bones of thine man, and their spirits languish and wait for release. Silence settled for a while. The air grew colder wherever the claimant cast his gaze. The giant moved with slow, careful steps, barely making a sound despite his size. Tall, like a hulking seaside cliff, he stood above even the tallest man who tread the earth. Neroth circled the table and walked up to him, staring into those vacant silvery flames that were the creature's eyes, and spoke in an even tone. Such pessimism does not suit thee, my friend, especially now. After leading us down this very path, I had to put my faith in thee, and as a result we have toppled a deity, are we not? Nay, we shall not suffer perils brought on by conceit. Let this day pass, and we shall double our efforts tomorrow when we are rested. Let my word be thine assurance. The golem crossed his arms and wordlessly rued the deficiencies of flesh, the constant necessities to rejuvenate and regenerate. He then said, Even so, it is not well to feel so assured of safety and success. Nay, not yet. Though we grievously hurt her, she had still slipped away, and it is only a matter of time until she puts her own schemes into motion. Her spells work against us, even now. The time that serves her serves us just as well. It may not be so. Neroth traded quick glances with his man. One of them stood up, young and sullen-eyed, cheeks burnt red with seafaring life. Are we in danger? This place warps itself in subtle ways. Time itself is a slave in these corridors. Jachim said. Another man raised his voice. He was somewhat older. His thinning hairline made his forehead look almost disproportionately large to his face, yet bore himself the noble gait, aloof, though in truth attentive. This would explain why my man could not accurately map the sanctum. Even after all these days, our documents seemed to be faulty. Now, methinks as if the tunnels themselves are capable of changing, rerouting at their own whim. Narath turned to Jashim, then said, If time itself is a slave amidst these walls, what effect that imparts on our plans and bodily conditions? I can only speculate for now, but time stretches and loops as if to leave us with temporal delay and sensory confusion, said he, folding his great thick arms. If so, we are at a loss of time compared to our kin on the homeland. Ill is this, for that surely serves them better than us. Will work thine wisdom, my friend. The golem contemplated for an interval, then said, The voyager treads the path of shadows and the arcane. She thinks not in the manner like thee. She gathers no armies or plays politics. Nay, she shall enact her scheme the way that which is most suitable to her. Serpent-like faculties, she will seek to undo us with means that which can counter our skills in art magical. We cannot thwart her without knowing where she moves and for what exact purpose. Thine wisdom has led us onto the trail. Before, it should do again. Chapter 1. The turquoise waves rolled upon the copper sands of southern shores. There, under the opal skies, whereon the sullen clouds stretched over taupe hills that lined the slanting coastlines, reared a lumbering, though curious cliff. Like a half-submerged beast, birthed by the depths of the sea it was, hulking and crudely shaped, enslaved to bear the last great castle of the Elkmere on his back. It was chained to the land with a long gray stone bridge, at the end of which was the gate town, and there hung a curious mist around that town, white and thin as a gossamer creeping upwards unto the hills for nigh half a mile long. This was the land of Eckmere, and in that castle, named the Eyrie, rested the last of the old blood, King Mashiji, who bore the crown of iron and pale gold shaped like the feathers of a hawk intertwined into a circlet. In the pinkish hue of the rising red sun, a shadow crept across the languid foams, nigh translucent, save for that its shape was like that of a dagger's blade. This blade, however, did not aim at the cliff nor the gate town, but was drifting upward, following the curved shorelines until at last plunged into the sands at a good distance from the settlement. By the grace of the ferryman, the voyager had returned to the lands of man, that which he had not seen for nigh 500 years. Charon's ship made manifest then, no longer a shadow, but the luminous vessel that tread the waves of the ether that lied yonder the starlit skies, now glimmering in red and golden hues by the light of a newborn dawn. Alas, pure Freydun, thine kin had fallen far, and are now but seeds sown in putrid soil. Father of Elkmere, thou had died the peaceful death, but thine dream lasted no more than 3 centuries, for no man can cheat the rules of the everlasting spiral. Still, if thou can hear my words in the hereafter, know that I have not yet done with thine ilk, she said. The voyager turned and cast her glance onto the gaunt, strange figure of Charon, the ferryman whose dim milky-colored eyes witnessed the terrible wonders and sepulchral spaces of the infinite and breathed the air of strange worlds, and who had listened to the laments of the dead since death tread the mortal realms. Tall he was, naked save for the loins around his waist, as if hewn from a single slab of seraphinite. His complexion was a dark crystalline green quality to it, smooth and gold. His visage was that of an old man, with hard features and a low brow, and under his stout, thick nose hung his beard, like a cluster of brass yellow kelp attached to a sunken statue. When he spoke, he did slowly with a low rumble, for he was ancient and patient and deeply sentimental. Oh, my dearest, I could take thee to a world 1,000 times more beautiful than this, where thine beauty would be welcomed amongst the lascivious nymphs and the coven of the incubi. Yet thine choice is that of an old bleeding world, he said. Perhaps one day I shall make my way to that world of beauty thou speak of, but this one is where I must settle my quarrels, for the threads of fate draw me here, and it is this world that I am fashioned for. The lady does as the lady wishes, but remember, should thou call for my aid once more, thou must pay me in turn, as now the favor is paid back, and rules must be abided again. Now I depart to the starlit seas of yonder skies, and to thee I give my heartfelt farewell. With that, they parted ways, and the ship faded into nothingness. The hybrid contemplated for a while, then she breathed deep in the air of this world, climbing the shore-side dunes, and then took a long look at the scenery manifesting before her, ghost-flamed eyes. Beyond the perception of the corporeal senses, where the ebbs of arcane energies moved and intertwined, a power of curious nature stirred, but a mind sufficiently evolved and altered could stalk these shadowy motions, and, as such, peering through the veil of matter and space, the voyager had saw these vagrant shades forming a malleable mural, a prelude, a mirage grown from the mist in her mind, and it was the image of the bygone civilization commemorated by the bloodshot gaze of a dying sun. Cast into red like the flames of the everlasting bonfire, the towers were but stumps of a mutilated hand, and the walls crumbled to blackened heaps. Then, like wind-blown dust, the visions dissolved into nothingness, leaving her with the sight of the present, the airy, rearing high, gilded and decaying opulence. That day, she only observed the city from afar, not by sight, but through her mind's eye. She sat still, as her consciousness drifted on the streams of spectral energies. She made the seabirds her eyes and ears, and through this she learned the routine of the Denzians, their habits and indulgences, their language and traditions. She then made the vermin her servitors, wherewith she learned the layout of the city, down to the secret alcoves and abandoned passages. When night neared, the voyager moved. She stripped nigh naked and wrapped the cloak of darkness around herself. Like an errant dust devil, she dashed across the fields, lithe-footed, silent, and imperceivable. The moon hung high like an opaque eye, and the night's sky was wrought with the scintillating lights of the meteor shower falling eastward. Lights of turquoise and green crossed the deep blue tapestry of those few awake knew that it was an omen, though be it ill or good, none could tell. The voyager quietly submerged herself in the calm cold waters, and since she had the blood of a sea nymph running strong in her, she swam swiftly and without need for air. Ere long, she rose on the other side, crawling onto the cold black rocks by the feet of the air under the western cliff wall. High above the bastions loomed, half-lit in the solemn saffron light of braziers, whilst the gloom spread in between like a murky veil stretching from the one to the other. There was no time for alternate routes, for the night was her shroud, and each moment precious for one such as her. But the darkness here was not deep enough. Thus she changed the color of her scales instead, and began to climb the rocky walls. Nimble and lithe she was, and soundlessly she made her way upward. The guards were valiant, well armed. Their brass fish-scaled armor chimed ever so slightly as they moved. Their numbers small, though, and so, with a serpent's sinewy grace, she tread the penumbra of darkness, crawling over the battlements, and at last disappearing in the darkness shadows that swelled amongst the tall, flat-faced buildings, amidst which the streets were narrow and numerous. Seldom did she see a soul outside, save that of the patrols here and there, and the beggars huddled in the remote corners and alleys of outer districts. So she conversed with those felines instead, and had them as company on her way to those remote paths and places, many of which were unknown even to the Denzians. Alas, the Elfmere were not like they were in ancient days. Their drive and passion naught but cinders, glimmers in the dust of a long-gone empire, the echo of bygone preeminence. Their might were the might of an over-the-hill wrestler. In these narrow veins, life flowed sluggishly. Be it day or night, it mattered little, for the Elkmere of this age were content but pensive people, enamored by the glory days of their past, whilst quietly lamenting their present fortunes, even as they were trapped in a world that no longer cared. At last, the voyager turned her attention to the king's tower, rearing high above the surrounding buildings, watching over this meager realm. The darkness deepened. The deep blue light that veiled the upper levels of the square-cut buildings retracted, and torches flickered by the subtle winds that swooped down from above. As an indivisible shape she moved, and swiftly she mounted the inner wall that surrounded the royal estate. The hybrid slithered down along the shades, through the rings of shrubs and slender trees, amongst the myriad small buildings that rested at the foot of the tower, then up the side of the tower, until she found a terrace with open windows. Therein she sensed a presence, still and breathing slowly, a man in sleep, yet troubled by feelings that lied deeper within. He laid on a couch, surrounded by the banalities of royalty, crests, silken curtains, and the rubied bed-decked jewelry. Before the slumbering man was a table burdened with scripts and scrolls and tomes, nearby flasks and bottles. Greed is a vice she never felt, for she was no human and thus did not think or feel the way they did. Nevertheless, these luxuries had great value, for they were as much of the mark of culture as they were the mark of self-indulgence. A worthy endeavor it would be to come again and save their craftsmanship from mouths of oblivion, should the possibility remain open, though for now she was rather interested in a peculiar man. Though he stank of ale, he was also quite handsome, a lean man with hair flowing down his shoulders and black curls. His complexion was a touch darker than those of the west and the north, but much fairer than those who lived in the sun-scorched deserts. His face shaven, save that of the goatee at the end of his chin. The voyager cocked her head, eyes closed, as her consciousness drifted to the edge of his dreams, catching fleeting glimpses of his dreams. The man began to stir, though, slowly coming back to the waking world. Pulled from the depths of his slumber, Captain Orell sat up, though somewhat befuddled in the brain. As his visions cleared, so did his mind. But for a fleeting moment, when he was in the interim, 'twas between dream and lucidity. It seemed as if the very shadows moved before him, or as if the strange presence came near and caressed his brow with a kind touch. As darkness flowed through the corridors, the hybrid drifted with it. The small rooms, the alcoves, the small crevices were hers to tread, and the light of the candles snuffed dead before her passing. Ere long, she found her way into the throne room itself, wherein she was greeted by the towering statue of an old familiar god. He squatted atop an elevated platform, built of basalt segments, illuminated by only the fires that circled him. His face was shrouded in the veil of the night that fluttered now and again as stray winds found their way in. It was a giant, made of onyx, squatting like an ape. Before him were 9 braziers, alive with dancing flames, and in his lap sat the throne of the Elkmere sovereign, crowned by a meek, elucidating azure light. Upheld in his outstretched hand was the eye of the Cyclops, an artifact most precious to these people, their prize, their heritage from the earliest days of their history. In it they sought oracles and visions, and the guidance from those high benefactors mortals often seek counsel with. The hybrid stepped into the amber light of the illuminating circle. Her scales shined with a faint dark purple hue, and her scarlet tresses fell onto her shoulders around her face of alabaster white beauty. She then took the throne, and the bright blue pools of her eyes gazed into the orbs above her head. The throne room had melted away. The concepts of dimensions, the distance and time disappeared, and the world became but streams of intertwined energies that sprawled out into the infinite. Into a luminous tapestry she gazed, in search for not the future, but a face, a faintly glimmering presence who bore a peculiar spark in him. Mist reared before her eyes, opaque and sullen gray, rippling with the quiet languor. In her mind, she raised her hand and touched the mist, twisting the threads of that silky grayness about her fingers. The haze enveloped her hand and began to slither about her arm and about her body. Submerged in the spectacle energies, she floated through nothingness until the curtain split and awarded her with the sight of the world once more. She was but an apparition, a faint translucent shape emerging from the flames of the gloomy cave. In there was a woman, whose attire was but fabrics decorated with feathers and feather-worn trinkets. Yet she was no hag, but a witch, still young, with lush chestnut hair reaching low, a face with a slightly upturned nose and cheeks red from the cold winds of the north, and on her arms rested a babe. The witch looked up, Her round green eyes went wide. She then raised her hand in a peculiar gesture and uttered wording invocations. The Voyager had no fear of this, for she was not of the same devil nor a vagrant entity. But that could be dispelled as such. Still, she troubled her not, and instead gazed at the babe. The hybrid turned away, her spirit drifted onto another place. Her mind sailed the spectral currents, fluttering images passed by her, but at last she found a peculiar thread. She stood on the rippling waves of silvery light. She turned and saw the northern shore, still blooming with the green of summer season, and from those shores, like the outstretched fingers of a hand, the war galleys of the Called sailed by her, though their crews unaware of her presence. It was then that she saw him, standing proud at the front of his vessel, long-shafted axe resting beside him. Her eyes looked beyond the surface of his flesh, and was pleased to see what she had found therein. Fate was playing with her hands, though this very moment has yet to make manifest. The sense of intimacy rose. Therewith, her instincts called out to her attention, wherefore she was forced to draw herself back into the corporeal form. She heard footsteps from outside the throne room, and so she hid behind an onyx statue. The tall arched door wings bemoaned the entrance of a lone presence, and peeking out from her hiding place, she saw that it was the same man who dozed in the room whereby she infiltrated these quarters. Captain Aurel could find not the means to explain the calling that brought him hither, save that he felt something strange in the air. Mercurial and nigh insomniac by nature, his nocturnal wanderings were surprise to none. But this time, he woke to see the sight of a sky, blemished with the ethereal lights of nocturnal heaven, falling eastward, like hail of arrows falling upon the scorched realm of the wasteland, where in the ancient histories and curses hideous beasts and demented cults lived. This portentous sign would arouse the interest of the Hierophants, the teachers and the counselors of the king, that he knew for certain. The common man shall gossip, the fishermen will pray that the omen was good, and the sailors in the wide world would make their sacrifices to please the gods of the skies and the seas. Aurel, however, had suffered a condition, that peculiar sense of cynicism that bellied a soul unsatisfied of his lot. He was still young, well within the most joyous days of his life, and yet rare was the time when he could draw an honest smile. Instead, he had to endure what felt like dull days of his position. He never vaunted as the captain of the city guard, watching as his uncle, King Mashigi, deteriorated and quietly waited the day to take his place. King Mashigi, sovereign of the Elkmir, the bridge between heaven and earth and the sea, was a sickly man, but his sickness was not that of the body or soul, but that of the mind. He was once as able as Aurel, meeker, more gentle in his temperance than he, much beloved by all. But as the years gone by, he had begun to succumb to the sickness that befell his father, and his father's father. Worse, Mashigi had no heir. He never wed, though why he never explained to anyone, not even when he was still sound of mind. In the end, forced to break tradition, the Hierophants put a scheme into preparation, thus choosing him to be the future heir. They taught him well, but they could never imbue him with the faith they had in him. To Aurel, the captain was like a mark of servitude. But a servitude to what end, he wondered? To merely continue his existence here? What good is a king without a grander purpose? An indecipherable sense of suspicion arose in him. He heard sounds of mischievous chuckles, at once distant, yet so close that it felt them as if devils were breathing down his neck. And therewith rose a gust of powerful winds, pushing him backward. The fires teetered at the edge of suffocating, and a good captain struggled against the inexplicable phenomena. Eventually, he relented and fled, mind reeling as he groped his way back to his room and slammed the door shut. He was gasping for a while thereafter, amazed and terrified. Then the soothing tone of a delicate voice touched his ears.